abstracta, I think it's weird to say that first you are connected, first the experience connects to the abstracta, and because it connects to the abstracta, it gets to have its phenomenal character. It makes more sense that it gets to have its phenomenal character, and that makes it connect to the abstracta. I'm using temporal language as a metaphor, right? Temporal priority as a metaphor for logical priority. So that's why I prefer, that's the roughest sketch of why I prefer phenomenological adverbialism over content adverbialism. But for the purposes of the talk, it doesn't really matter. Some adverbialism is all I need to avoid commitment to merely intentional objects. And the last objection is that there are all the problems of the re-intentionality, how we connect to actual things in the world. If representation is this adverbial thing, if it's not a matter of being related to the world, how do we connect to the world? You have the whole specter of a corrosive skepticism looming there. And it will find expression in more technical issues when we discuss the re-intentionalities, the intentionality that connects to particulars in the world. I want to say a couple of things about this. First, I don't deny that there is a representation relation. Many representations do bear a representation relation to something in the world, namely the veridical ones. What I'm claiming is that it's not universal and therefore not constitutive of representations that they do. Most representations, if we're lucky, do have a representation relation, do bear a representation relation to the world, but some don't. So it cannot be a requirement on being a representation that you bear a representation relation to the world. So what I want to say is that there is a representation relation, but it's involved in intentionality only contingently. So that's one thing. So that we do connect to the world, but only in the veridical cases. I think maybe that's just all we really want to say. Now, about more specifically the Dirac problems, for me, this is the most difficult. I have to think a whole lot more about this, how to deal with this issue of Dirac intentionality in an adverbial account of intentionality. So in Dirac intentionality, you don't think that Jimmy is cool, you think of Jimmy that he's cool. So you're related to Jimmy, the thinking of relation, and you think that he's cool. So that's a difference there in the logical form of the reports. You don't think that Jimmy is cool, you think of Jimmy that he's cool. Some people claim that you can reduce the Dirac intentionality to the dicto intentionality. Ernest Sosa holds that. I don't know what the argument is, but I need to get my act together and read it and figure out if I agree. Another idea that I had was to deny that the Dirac intentionality is a real kind of intentionality, claim that it's a rubber duck. Just like a rubber duck is not really a kind of duck, the Dirac intentionality is not really a kind of intentionality. Why say that? Mainly because I think the definitive properties of intentionality, the definitive characteristics of intentionality are not featured, not exhibited by the Dirac intentionality. So what are the definitive characteristics? That reports of intentionality will A, fail existential generalization, and B, fail truth-preserving substitution of coreferential terms. So for example, when I say, I think that Jimmy is cool, it doesn't follow that there is someone such that I think that they're cool. And it also doesn't follow that, suppose Jimmy is Johnny's best friend. If I think that Jimmy is cool, it doesn't follow that I think that Johnny's best friend is cool. But when I think of Jimmy that he's cool, it does follow that there is someone such that I think of them that they're cool. And it also does follow that I think of Johnny's best friend that he's cool. So these definitive characteristics of intentionality will just not be exhibited by reports of Dirac intentionality. So maybe Dirac intentionality is not really a kind of intentionality. That seems a bit like a crazy view somehow, but like I said, I need to think about it much more. In conclusion, what I want to say is that we can avoid ontological commitment to merely intentional objects if we hold two things. One, that all intentionality derives from phenomenal intentionality, and two, that phenomenal intentionality is adverbial. If we hold these two things, then we don't have to commit ontologically to merely intentional objects. And that means that the fun is still on. We can still debate mathematical entities and time and etc. It hasn't been already settled that they all exist. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Now, let's see. I've got Michaelis first. If the rest of you could just keep your hands up for a moment, please. Michaelis first.
I have a question about your representation of intentionality thought of as a relation to a content as being a form of adverbialism. It struck me that what you want to say there is rather that it's consistent with adverbialism, but it's certainly not of its own character an adverbial theory, because it depends what your account of content is. And for instance, suppose you were Russellian about content, so you thought that the content was a structured sort of object, proposition, and it actually contained objects. So then that's no form of adverbialism, I say. So I think you spoke far too quickly there, and you should say it's consistent with, but it certainly doesn't entail adverbialism.
Okay, so what I want to say is that there are two notions of content there. One notion that this person can resort to, and one that they cannot. They cannot because then they will land in the can of worms that I'm trying to extract us from. So all this is within under the assumption, this is all this discussion is happening under the assumption that we don't want the can of worms. The Russellian notion of a content is precisely the notion of the content that I think they cannot resort to, because that is the kind of notion that will land you with the can of worms. It's a notion in the Russellian notion is that is what you're thinking about. The content of your thought is what you're thinking about. In that sense, content is just like an object. So when you use a notion of content that is not like object, then the Russellian view of content in that sense is not on the cards.
Okay, so
in the cards.
Let me just then repeat and see whether you agree with me then. The dialectical situation was you had a challenge from those who thought intentionality was a relation to content. Your rejoinder to that objection, remember that was supposed to be an objection, was, oh no, but don't you see intentionality as a relation to content is a form of adverbialism. Now I'm saying to you, false. What you say is actually false. In the dialectical context, you cannot get away with saying that. What you've got to do is not say, oh, we're trying to avoid the can of worms. What you've got to say is, oh no, of the various ways you can think of intentionality as a relation to content, there are some ways in which are consistent with my adverbialism that I'm trying to endorse. But the rejoinder you gave wasn't that. Rather it was, oh, that sort of response is a form of adverbialism. And that's why I say that was too strong a claim.
I'll have to contemplate some of this to see if this is how I was thinking of it. But yeah, let's just go, suppose there isn't any talk here and someone rolls in and says, intentionality is a relation to a content. I will say to them, look, I might agree with you and I might not agree with you, like Michele says. I will agree with you if you use a notion of content that is not the same as the notion of an object, is not what you're thinking about. If you use that, then I'll agree with you, and I'll also say that you're in the same family of views as my view as it happens, but a different variant. If you say content is something else, content